Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Harfat and welcome to a brand new video. In today's video, I'd like to share with you textual criticism of the New Testament. What is textual criticism as a whole? And this is aimed towards Muslims as well, because in the Islamic tradition there is pretty much little to none such thing as textual criticism, because the Quran is compiled cohesively and the copying practices of the scribes have been faithful to the earliest text that we have. However, when it comes to the New Testament, textual criticism is necessary. I'll explain what textual criticism is in a bit, but just to give you a brief overall picture, the reason there is a need for textual criticism in the New Testament, for the New Testament, is because that there are thousands and thousands of manuscripts that contains variants, and so in order for us to have a printed text, to have the New Testament printed, scholars basically needs to needs to go through all these different manuscripts that they have and to see which of these variants should be printed. Okay, basically they want to go back to the earliest plausible text. Okay, and I'll explain what the terms are used for this. But scholars called textual critics, they try to reconstruct the earliest text of the New Testament from thousands of these variants that we have currently. And so this is a different scenario when compared to the Quran. There is no such thing to the extent that we have for the New Testament. Now the Old Testament as well is subjected to textual criticism even more than the Quran. I'm not saying that there's no such thing as textual criticism to the Quran, because there are. And for those who say that there's no such thing as textual criticism to the Quran, basically they don't really know that there's such a thing, but it is not to the degree and significance. Well, it is significant, but it is not to the degree that we have for the New Testament. I'll turn to the Oxford Companion of the Bible. Textual criticism, this is page 739. Because at times the word criticism can mean finding fault with, it is important to note that when it is used here, it means evaluation. Okay. The analysis of something with the intent of determining its value. The wording of the manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible and of the Greek New Testament varies here and there to a greater or lesser degree. It is necessary, therefore, to employ the criteria of textual criticism in order to evaluate the various readings, so as to determine, if possible, the original author's text prior to the modification that appear in the extant manuscripts. Extant basically means the current manuscripts that we have, okay, in our possession. For the original autographs were lost long ago. Autograph basically means the original, what the author actually wrote, or it could also be, you know, the copies of the copies of the copies. But autograph, when it's being used, generally refers to like the original, like the autograph of the Gospels, for example, the autograph of Colossians or Ephesians or Philemon, we no longer have. Okay, and so I'll not drag on and give you all the technical explanation that Professor Metzger and Coogan actually explained there. I'll just give you in layman's term. First things first, the textual criticism, it is not something modern. It is something that even the patristic fathers engage in to a certain extent, because if you read their works, for example, Origin of Alexandria mentioned that the book of Hebrews was probably not written by the Apostle Paul because of the vocabulary differences when it comes to the letters of Paul and the letters of Hebrew. And so early patristic fathers already engages in textual criticism, but it wasn't enhanced up until the Enlightenment period, whereby especially when due to the invention of the printing press, scholars had to determine which are the texts to print, The same way that they had to determine, like scribes had to determine which are the manuscripts to copy. When there's variant readings, scribes actually had to copy, because scribes actually engages in textual criticism as well in the past. Because if you look at the manuscripts that we have, scribes change the text. Okay, sometimes they want to correct a mistaken text, and sometimes, unfortunately, they do this incorrectly because they do not have access to the earliest copy of the text, and the earliest copy of the text only came to light in the modern era, because of archaeological efforts. And so, but scribes of the past, for example, in the 14th or 13th century, they do not have these, earlier copies that, for example, scholars today have, like Codex Sinaiticus, and also known as Codex Aleph and Codex B, Codex Vaticanus, the two most significant codex. Codex basically means like book. Okay, because before, I'll get to this as well, but because before, the earlier writings of the New Testament were in rolls, in papyrus rolls. Okay, this brings us to the topic. Let's start at the very beginning. What was the materials used that scribes used to write on? The materials that they use is papyrus, or was papyrus, and papyrus was an aquatic plant, or is an aquatic plant that grows in marshlands. Okay, the roots of the papyrus plants actually spread out in search of nutrients, and because the roots actually spread out, it allows the plant to grow for about 12 feet or even 15 feet long. It is a very tiny plant. It doesn't have a bulky stem or what. It is a very tiny plant, and it grows in marshlands, especially in Egypt, towards the Nile Delta, and in the other parts of the Mediterranean, whereby it is not too cold, and it is there's a lot of marshes and there, because nutrients is found there when there's a lot of mud and so on and so forth. And so papyrus was the invention of the Egyptian, according to most scholarly theories, and our earliest papyrus that we have actually dates to about the 2000 millennium, before the Common Era. And even though papyrus was a very popular writing materials in Egypt, it wasn't used until about the 5th century BCE or so, before the Greeks actually use it, and before the Romans later on actually carry on that tradition. When it comes to the Christian literature, the early manuscripts, probably before the 4th century, they were written in papyrus. We do not have any manuscripts in clay tablets, even though clay tablets was widely used, and definitely not paper, because even though paper was invented by the Chinese about 100 BCE, but it wasn't made popular. And we have paper as a writing material being used to write the New Testament about 10th century onwards, but they're not significant to textual criticism because they're later. When it comes to textual criticism, we want to get to as early a source as possible, because that is the lesser years it has removed from the autographs, the better it is. And so, for example, if we have a manuscript that dates to the 10th century, and we have a manuscript that dates to the 4th century, it is not necessarily that the manuscripts that dates to the 4th century is better than the manuscripts that date to the 10th century. This is often the misconception. The earlier the manuscripts doesn't mean it is generally the better ones, because what could happen is that we have a 10th century manuscripts that is a copy of a 2nd century manuscripts, and if we have a 4th century manuscripts, but it is a copy of a 3rd century manuscript. And so which ones are much closer to the original manuscripts, to the original autograph, the original? Definitely the 10th century manuscripts, because it is copied from a 2nd century manuscript. Now it could be that it is copied from the 10th century manuscript, it is copied from a 6th century manuscript, that's copied from a 5th century manuscript, that's copied from a 4th, from a 3rd, but it is copied from a 2nd century manuscript. Okay, and the copying practices have been pretty much faithful. There's lesser mistakes. Okay, and so this is one of the family that we have. So family of manuscripts that dates all the way to the 2nd century. Whereas if we have a 16th century manuscript, for example, or even an 8th century manuscript, but it is copied from a 7 and a 6 and a 5, the 4th century manuscripts, and then the 4th century manuscript, it is copied from probably a different languages, because some of the manuscripts, the early manuscripts, are in Syriac, translated from the Greek, and then it is translated to different languages, and it is also copied and translated to Greek. And so that is a translation of a copy, and so it doesn't, it doesn't have much credibility as compared to manuscripts that is written in Greek, and the family dates all the way back to the 2nd century. Now obviously all manuscripts eventually do go back to the earlier times, but whether do we have the extant manuscripts or not for us to evaluate, because if we don't, then the doesn't mean anything basically. And so let's say if we have the 10th century manuscripts that is copied from a 2nd century manuscripts, okay, even though we do not have the complete copy of the 2nd century manuscripts, but if we go through the works of the church fathers, the patristic fathers, or even the text that it has quoted, and if we look at some of the texts, it agrees with all these earlier texts or of the manuscripts, then it basically means that we have a very strong textual tradition here, okay, whereby the copying practices have been done with due care and caution, and so this is a much better manuscript, even though it is a 10th century manuscript, but it is a direct copy from a 2nd century manuscript that doesn't have a lot of mistakes, okay, throughout its textual tradition. And so the older the manuscripts doesn't always mean that it is the better manuscripts, because sometimes they could be a copy of a translated manuscripts, and once you translate a manuscripts and you try to translate it to a different languages and then translate it back to the original languages, because for example it could be 2 centuries removed, because what happens in the earlier times was that Christianity is a missionary religion from the earliest period as well, and so when the Gospels were written in Greek, not a lot of people understood Greek, and so it was quickly translated to Syriac or Aramaic. It was translated to a former Semitic language. And so because of this, it was the missionaries was able to spread the message of Jesus. And so later on, when we have the when missionaries traveled to Armenia, okay, modern day Armenia, they translated the text to Armenian. And then when missionaries traveled to Rome, they translated the text to the Latin, okay, the Latin Vulgate, which Jerome later on translated to. And so we do have instances whereby the Latin Vulgate was actually translated to Slavonic. Okay, was translated back to Greek, or the Aramaic text, or the Syriac was actually translated back into Greek. And so things do get lost in translation there. And so if we have a manuscript tradition that is Greek all the way, and it is being copied from its original language, then those are the much more superior manuscripts. It gets complicated and technically in a sense, but that is how it is generally. And so the older the manuscripts, if you have 2 manuscripts, you compare one for example 8th century and one is 10th century, doesn't mean the manuscripts on the the 8th century manuscripts is generally much superior than the 10th century manuscripts, for reasons I've explained. Now, so papyrus, the early manuscripts of the New Testament were all written in papyri. It was until the 4th century, meaning the 300s, whereby we do have a lot of text being written on parchment or vellum, which is the higher grade of parchment, because scribes finally realized that papyrus is not a material that could actually, sustain for quite a long time, and so parchment was being used, and also during this period, rolls was no longer being used, and so scribes actually turned the whole thing into a book to reduce costs, because it reduced about 46% or 40% of the cost, because materials in the ancient world is expensive. So if you have a roll, for example, I'll just use this tissue as an example. So if you have a roll, okay, and this is what it would have been written here, and then the back part doesn't get used, and so it is a waste of material there. So when it comes to when it is being turned to a codex form, which is a book like this, okay, then scribes could actually write on both pages, and so it saves a lot of money. And so if you account for the costings of the materials, the ink, and all those things, scribes actually save about 26% of the production costs when you use codex books, and as compared to when you use rolls or scrolls. And so from the 4th century onwards, vellum was also used in this way, because it is a much more rigid material, it lasts longer. Now thankfully, because if papyrus will continue to be used throughout the Middle Ages as well, I don't think that we would have a lot of our manuscripts survive, because we have a lot of manuscripts, about 5,800 of the Greek New Testament manuscripts, and majority of them are actually written on vellum. The earlier we go, they are written on papyrus, from the 2nd to the 3rd century, even the 4th century also, and it is still being used all the way until the 6th centuries. But once we get to the 8th century onwards, majority of our manuscripts were written predominantly on parchment or on vellum. And this is also a great thing, because scribes can illustrate and they can do a lot of things. And we do also have vellums that have been erased. Vellums are basically leather, animal skin, back of the animal skin, and so scribes erased them, and so they wrote something on top of it. And so one of the methods that textual scholars use is actually to determine the erased text, because the erased texts are generally much older than the present text that we have on vellum. So a lot of studies have been done on this as well. Now, what about the inks and the writing materials? Scribes use something called the reed pens. Okay, I made a video of this before, as well as I believe I made a video of the inks as well that they use, so we can skip this part. Now let's go to the more important portion of textual criticism, and that is the handwriting style. Okay, the earlier handwriting of the scribes, because handwritings do evolve, okay, over time in the ancient world. The earlier, when it comes to the New Testament, the earlier handwritings were mostly in uncial, meaning in capital letters. It wasn't until the minuscule script, the cursive script, so that scribes could actually write faster. The cursive script was invented on the by the 8th or the 9th century, and pretty much after the 10th century or so, the New Testament that we have, the New Testament texts, were all written using the cursive script. The unsealed script was no longer being used. And so if you compare this, if you see a manuscript that has the minuscule script, the cursive script, and you have a manuscript that contains the capital letter script, then you'll definitely know that the capital letter scripts are much earlier than the minuscule script, because the minuscule script was invented on the 8th, 9th century onwards. And so, but that doesn't mean that we should disregard the manuscripts that was written using the minuscule script, because it is just basically a different script to tell you the date of the manuscripts, okay, the probable date, later or before the 10th or the 8th century. But that doesn't mean that the minuscule script should not be superior than the unsealed script, because the minuscule script, the parchment that contains the minuscule script, could be a direct copy of the unsealed script, and the direct copy could be dated to about the 2nd or the 3rd century, or even earlier. And so there's a lot of factors to consider here, textual scholars basically, not me. And so they have to consider a lot of things here as well. The other thing is about the transcriptional probabilities. Now what does this mean? The transcriptional probabilities is basically what scribes actually seem more likely to copy a text, because we do know that scribes actually make changes to the text because they want to pursue their own theological ideas, or the theological ideas of their church, for example. And so and we also know that scribes sometimes, when they look at for example, they have been copying Mark for the entire week also, and so when they came across a text, when they're copying Matthew and they came across a text, okay, that contradicts Mark, and so scribes who actually want to change the text, so that they want to harmonize the text, meaning they want to make this, they want to smoothen out the contradiction. Okay, they wouldn't want to have any contradiction in the text, and so scribes is more likely to transcribe to smoothen out the text, okay, than to actually make the text contradict each other. And so this is also one of the methods. So for example, when we have 2 or 3 different manuscripts of the New Testament, okay, and when we have 2 different for example, let's just call it book of the New Testament, which dates earlier on. And so when we compare these 3 different books of the New Testament, and so for example A, B and C, manuscripts of books A and B contains harmonization of this quote unquote contradicting passage, whereas manuscript C actually contains the contradiction. Okay, and so it is more likely that scribes would want to actually smoothen out the contradiction than to actually create contradiction. And so for that particular passage, it is generally believed that the text that contradicts one another, it is basically the earliest text, or the oldest text, or the superior text compared to the other 2 books A and B. And so this is also one of the ways that scholars actually determine the transcriptional probabilities. Now the intrinsic probabilities is basically the internal evidence, okay, the internal evidence of the quote unquote pericope, the text, a portion of the text, okay, it's called a pericope. And so what is more likely to have been written by the authors, okay, in the autographs, basically the original, what is basically likely to have been written by the original authors, yeah, of the Gospels, or of the book of Peter, for example, letter of Peter, for example, what is more likely the author could have probably written, comparing it to what scribes could have actually copied. Now, scribes do make a lot of mistakes. For example, they suffer from, for example, if we have words, two sentences that ends with the same words, instead of copying two times, okay, they just copy the second sentence, okay. And also when scribes, they should copy only one sentence, and then they ended up repeating and copying the same sentence twice, okay, because they're not paying attention. They have poor eyesight, for example, or they could not even hear properly, okay. Because one of the scribal practices in the past is that scribes actually, in certain monastery, there will be someone reading the text, and then there will be a group of scribes actually copying, okay. And so, for example, sometimes a scribe couldn't hear properly, and so he wrote something different compared to his peers also. And also, there's no in the past, there's no such thing as proper spelling, proper way to spell a word. Okay, some scribes spell things differently than the others, and so, for example, if we have two manuscripts, that contains the same spelling, and whereas we have a corpus of other manuscripts that also contains the same spelling, but they do not spell these words similar to the two manuscripts that we have. And so basically from this we can build a relation, family ties, for example, whereby these two manuscripts that has the same spelling, that does not have the same spelling as the other corpus of manuscripts out there, then basically we can determine that a few possibilities. For example, that these two scribes, they have connection with one another. It could be that these two books were written by the same scribes, or it could be that scribes living in Turkey, for example, and Christian missionary from Syria, for example, travel to Turkey, and then brought along these manuscripts, and then the scribes in Turkey copied these manuscripts, and they copy the same spelling convention as well, and they do not know that the spelling convention is different, okay, because there's no such thing as a fixed spelling convention in the past. And so we do know that for some reason these manuscripts must be related to one another, and it must come from the same textual family, meaning the family of manuscripts, the tradition of the manuscripts, okay. And so that is also one of the ways. So if we can determine that out of these two manuscripts, manuscripts A or manuscripts B, manuscripts A probably dates to around the 5th century, then we probably know that this is not the earliest copies that we have, okay. And so this is one of the ways that scholars actually determine. Also, moving back to, I haven't really actually explained what is inscriptional probabilities, is what the original authors, the autograph would have looked like. Like, for example, in one manuscript whereby there's a mention of Jesus Barabbas, okay, and the other manuscripts doesn't have a mention of Jesus Barabbas, they just have a mention of Barabbas, okay. And so why would the author mention or want to write Jesus Barabbas, okay? And so what is possibly the reading here? Is it just Barabbas, okay, or Jesus Barabbas? For those of you who don't know, this is the passage that I'm talking about, whereby Pontius Pilate want to free one of the criminals out there, and so the Jews call out, we want Barabbas to be free instead of Jesus. And so in one manuscript we have Jesus Barabbas there, and in a couple of other manuscripts we just have Barabbas. And so what is more likely the original reading that is found in the autographs? Even though we will never be able to know, Okay, but what is the intention of the author mentioning Jesus Barabbas as to just mention Barabbas? And what is the more likely option or the theology of scribes when they copy this text? Would they want to omit Jesus from the text, or would they actually want to include Jesus in the text? Okay, and it is more likely that scribes actually would want to remove Jesus from the text, okay, than as to want to include Jesus from the text, because they do not want to associate criminal to Jesus, because Barabbas was actually criminal. And so scribes is more likely to remove or to disassociate Jesus with any criminal. And so I believe that Jesus Barabbas is probably earlier in the manuscripts as compared to just Barabbas, because it is more likely, based on transcriptional probability, okay, that scribes will actually want to remove Jesus from the text, because they do not want to associate Jesus with a criminal. And it is more likely, based on inscriptional probabilities, that the author actually include Jesus Barabbas inside for whatever reason. Okay, and so there are reasons, but we do not need to get through this because it gets too technical. But it is more likely that the author actually includes Jesus inside. Okay, and scribes later on remove it. Now the other passage is about the Gospel of Luke, the sweating blood passage. Now, what is more likely? Is it more likely the author includes the sweating blood passages in the Gospel of Luke, or is it more likely that scribes actually, came out with this for whatever reason? Okay, most of the time we don't know the actual reason. We just know what it's more likely for them to have included and what is more likely for them to have removed. Yeah, because we do not have scribes to interview. We no longer have them here, and so for most of the time we do not actually know the actual reason. But it could be theological, it could be a mistake. Okay, but if we were to say that if scribes include an entire passage, it is less likely a mistake than it is to actually be an intentional change, because mistake is unintentional changes to the text of the New Testament. But when it comes to actually including the whole passage in, it is highly probable, unless the scribes must have been really not paying attention, okay, to actually include a passage that is actually not in the original. Okay, I explain this much more clearly, whereas intentional changes can also be from an unintentional, unintentionally done, in a sense, because the scribes are just basically copying the manuscripts. Okay, they do not know that this passage is actually an interpolation, because they just copy these manuscripts. Okay, and so unintentionally they copied a mistake. Okay, but we are talking about the initial scribe that actually include the passages. For example, Luke sweating blood passage in there. Now, if we examine the entire Lucan corpus, the bodies of writings of Luke, okay, the theology whereby Jesus is sweating blood, and if you look at all the other corpus of the Lucan writings, you'll find that this small passage is an odd one out, because in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is very composed, he is very calm. Even when he is being put on the stake, okay, to be crucified, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know." And so to have a passage whereas Jesus is, he's nervous, he's sweating until his sweat, comes out like blood, that portrays a different Jesus, and it is not consistent with the entire corpus of works that is found in Lucan's Gospel. And so this is an extraordinary passage here that it is definitely not inside Luke, because it is an odd one out, you can see. And so due to this, scholars have concluded that this is an oddity. It is something that is not normal, and so scribes is more likely to compose this than it is actually to have been the author, the autographs to have to be included this passage. And so this is something that scribes actually invented, and over the years, other scribes are not aware that they are actually copying an interpolation, which is why we have manuscripts that contain this interpolation. And if you actually look at the corpus of manuscripts that we have, this passage is actually not found in the earliest manuscripts that we have. And so if we look at and if we are able to trace its genealogy, then you can find that this passage probably appears in a period of history, because before this period of history, this passage of sweating blood is not found in any of the manuscripts that we have. Now the other interpolation is about 1 John, the woman taken, the adulterous woman passage. It is found in the Latin manuscripts, okay, but it is not found in the Greek and earliest extant manuscripts that we have. And so it is more probable that later on, when scribes translate this, when scribes translate the Greek into Latin, or whatever languages into Latin, okay, that somehow they have actually included this interpolation inside the text, whereas it is not found in our earliest Greek manuscripts. Okay, in fact, if I'm not mistaken, it is not even found in any early Greek manuscripts. Okay, it is definitely not found in the uncial writing, and it is not found in the Greek minuscule writings before the 10th century, if I'm not mistaken. And so this is found in the Latin, and unfortunately this is what the King James Bible use. Okay, the translator of the King James Bible, they use the Latin to translate into English, and which we have the King James Bible. And so in the King James Bible, which I have here, the King James Bible, you do have the woman taken into adultery, the adulterous woman passage in it. Whereas if you look at the scholarly edition of the Greek New Testament, they do not have this passage. This passage has been removed. In fact, it has been removed with the revision that Metzger did for the RSV, and so it has been removed. And so it is more likely that scribes actually invented this, or someone invented this, and then the scribe just copied it without actually knowing that it is not there, than to actually have been the author to actually wrote this, because it is not found, okay, in the earliest manuscripts. And also, if we examine this passage, the woman taken to adultery, the vocabulary and the whole narrative doesn't flow. It's like you are reading a different John. And so it is based on this evidence itself, based on the language, the text, the analysis of the words and the vocabularies and so on and so forth, it is more likely that the author do not write this passage. Now, so we've gone through scribes making mistakes, unintentional mistakes and intentional mistakes. A lot of the New Testament manuscripts contains unintentional mistakes, like mistakes in spelling errors, for example, because there's no such thing as a spelling convention, and also spelling errors in a sense whereby the scribes couldn't actually spell properly. Okay, they would spell the same word differently, even though it is they've written it in the previous portion of the same manuscripts, and so they do not have a standardized spelling convention, and so they just spell the same thing differently. And also a lot of grammatical mistakes. For example, the author of Mark made a lot of grammatical mistakes, and so the author of Matthew having Mark in front of him, the Gospel of Mark, smoothen out the grammatical mistakes of Mark. So in a sense, correcting the mistakes of Mark. Okay. And if the author of Matthew doesn't have the original Mark, it could be that Mark was actually written in without a lot of mistakes, but because earlier scribes are not able to copy, they are not trained scribes, and so when they copy the Gospel of Mark, or when they heard the Gospel of Mark, then they probably made a lot of these grammatical mistakes. And so it could also be that the autographs doesn't have a lot of mistakes, and so when scribes copied the autographs, they made a lot of mistakes. And so when the author of Matthew actually copied the copy of the autographs of Mark, they smoothen out the mistakes that the scribes had copied, without knowing that the scribes had actually made grammatical mistakes, which the autograph itself doesn't have any mistakes. And so these are all possibilities, but we do not have the original autographs. We do not have the autographs, okay, and so we are not able to tell. Our earliest and complete New Testament manuscripts date to about the early 4th century, meaning the 300s, and the two significant manuscripts of this era, Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. Out of these two codices, Codex Vaticanus is basically the best manuscripts that we have. Codex Vaticanus, it is currently in the Vatican Library. When we go to the 5th century, we have Codex Bezae. Codex Bezae is also one of our earliest codices, and also amongst the best codices that we have. And so, but scholars do not only depend on these codices. Okay, doesn't mean we have the earliest manuscripts or book of the New Testament. We should generally accept that as, you know, the strongest text. That is not how it is, because we do have early papyri manuscripts, okay, that actually differs to these codices that I've just mentioned. And so which one could be better? You know, by default, the earlier the better, but that doesn't necessarily always follow. So there's a lot of factors to take into consideration here and there. And so just because we have an early manuscripts, that doesn't mean that we should read Sinaiticus. Okay, today, if you look at the Nestle Aland, basically, before I go there, I just explain that today scholars have came up with what we call a selection of texts which they seem, or which they think, okay, is the earliest that we have. What the patristics of the past, or the people of the past, could have possibly been reading. Okay, they basically have reconstructed the New Testament based from out of the 5,800 Greek manuscripts that we have, out of the 8,000 Latin manuscripts that we have, you know, and also in other languages, but the other languages are not basically it doesn't affect textual criticism. The three main languages that actually, you know, scholars take into consideration are the earlier languages, like the Aramaic, the Syrian, the Peshitta, the Greek, obviously, and the Latin Vulgate of Jerome. And so when we go to the Arabic, when we go to the Slavonic, when we go to all these other languages, definitely English is not, and so they all have no bearings on textual criticism because they're much later. Okay. And so, ladies and gentlemen, that is just basically a summary of what textual criticism is. Obviously, it is more than this, but this is just a summary. I recommend you a book, though. if you have no idea about textual criticism, or if you found my presentation interesting and you want to read more about this and know more about how you get your New Testament to begin with, because I've not actually talked about the apparatus yet. Okay, what are the apparatus and how do you actually use the apparatus, and what are the majority texts, what are the different methods, like CBGM, for example, the coherent based genealogical method, and what was the methods used in the past to gather all these data and to come out with the 27 books of the New Testament, and to confidently say that this is what the ancients would have plausibly used. Okay, but all these are more towards the technical side, which is very difficult to explain, because you do need some pictures, demonstrations here and there to actually help you understand. But you can refer to Jacob Harold Greenlee, J. Harold Greenlee, a great scholar. He wrote this in 1995, and so some of the methods of actually what textual scholars use is not updated, but about 80% of the book also is still, it gives you a basic introduction, but nevertheless it is actually an interesting introduction. And if you wish to find out more, you can go to literatures that I've recommended in the past about the books on textual criticism. You can refer to that video, inshallah. But yeah, anyway, I don't want to drag this video too long. I'll see you on my next one. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.